Kipper, you mentioned brain chemistry as a root of addiction. How does environment fit into this? How does that affect what's going on in our brain?
Environmental cues start when we're about 2 years old. So if you grow up in a family where there is abuse, where there's drug addiction, where there's incarceration, divorce, these things are very strong predictors of future addictive behaviors. So the environment is very important. The community environment is important. You might live in a community that sanctions drug use. You might live in or be in a social network that fosters that. So environment is very important, and it's not to marginalize it in this discussion. The genetics are certainly the thing that puts you in harm's way, and the environment is something that pushes you over the top. Jesse?
I know in the book you guys talk about the new paradigm of addiction medicine, and I was wondering if that's a personal subject for either of you. I was wondering how that paradigm connects for both of you.
The new paradigm for me, it's on the back flap of the book. I am an ex-addict, and I was really gone. I was a dopamine guy, cocaine, and God, went through rehab after rehab. I was on that treadmill, and nothing really worked for me until I met David. But powerlessness did not work for me, and it does not work for about 90% of the people. Now that it's a medical disease with genetics and with neurotransmitters and things like that, you can be proactive. Tell me a disease, a medical disease, that is cured by doing nothing, by being powerless. None. And this one too. But it also means that addicts shouldn't be judged, as David said, as bad people, as scumbags, as people without will, anything like that. We need to shift it now to, hey, your addiction may not be your fault, but you can do something about it. So it is your responsibility.
The new paradigm for me is that it's a medical disease, a chronic disease. Nobody gets cured in 28 days. It's forever that you have to do this. And people relapse, which is fine. There are reasons that people relapse, which is about their stress. You teach them how to deal with their stress. So it's a long answer to your question, but to me that's the new paradigm. Sid?
Why is it that teenagers are more susceptible to addiction, and what do you think is the most important thing for them to remember in order to prevent it?
Well, teenagers, your brain doesn't develop, your prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until you're in your mid-20s. And that's your judgment center. And then there's an area right under that, the inferior frontal cortex, which is your ability to say yes and no to things. So they sort of work together. That's not fully developed until you're in your mid-20s. So that's why teenagers are sort of omnipotent and they know everything. And so that's the basic issue. Also, teenagers are exposed to a group mentality. You want to fit in. Your bodies are changing. Your skin is changing. Your voice is changing. So you want to be in groups. And now it's very common for people to take those bad feelings and treat them with drugs. So drug use is rampant. And so that's why teenagers are in a very vulnerable position. And also at that point, teenagers are not usually talking to their parents about these things. Russell?
Yeah, this may be in your book. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm wondering, are you alone on the front lines with this paradigm? Do you have other communication with other doctors?
No, I think I'm not Madame Curie here. This is information that's out there, and a lot of this is information that I've learned in these conferences and at these meetings and in my readings. Most of it I've learned actually through experience. And so no, I'm definitely not alone. And there are a lot of doctors that treat addiction in similar ways. I mean, Brad, you know several doctors that treat this disease. Brad's a psychologist, and you've seen this in the community. I think everybody has a slightly different way that they deal with it, but the information is out there. This is you're not reading that the world is now round. That information is out there.
And again, if I may step in, David's too modest to say it, but David was in the forefront of this. And but now the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which you can go to at asam.org, I think it is. It's either .org or .com. It's now in every state, and there are doctors who belong to ASAM, and they have conventions every year in the state societies. There's not only American Society, but there's California Society of Addiction Medicine, CSAN, there's the New York, and so it's out there, and it is, it's going to flood, but it's flooding slowly, you know. It's not a tsunami.
10 years ago in these meetings, it was very behaviorally based, and it didn't make sense to me that it was just that. But when the science started cashing in and people could see this, then people slowly sort of came over to the other side. But that room was always an interesting room because there were, most of the people thought, well, this is just behavioral disease, even those treating this. But now I think if you were to attend one of those meetings, most of the people now are in agreement with what's in the book.
While you gentlemen were in the process of writing the book, what did both of you learn about the topic or about the process?
That's an interesting question because one of the issues in the book we talk about dopamine, and the issue is dopamine in excess or is dopamine a deficiency syndrome when you have these problems. And for a long time the research was on the fence. No one knew. And in our book we talk about dopamine problems being an excess problem. Well, the reality is very recently this has been turned around. So we now know that it's a dopamine deficiency that creates this. Fortunately, the paperback book is coming out in the fall, so we're able to sort of correct the science, but that's science. And so we learned a lot about, the science was always dynamic. The genetic stuff was really interesting.
I think I learned, by the way, it's not coming out in paperback, it's coming out in trade paper. But what I learned is that everybody wants to feel good, but nobody. And I had kind of suspected this because I hung out with addicts for, 3 or 4 years. Everybody wants to feel good, but nobody wants to be an addict. But the failure rate has been so massive. And the cold turkey withdrawal is sometimes so torturous that they've just given up. They've given up hope. And one of the things in the personalized recovery program that David does is give people back hope.
You've spoken mostly about substance abuse or substance addiction. Can you say something about behavioral addictions? Gambling, sex, other addictions that don't...
All the behavioral, that's a really great question, by the way, and it's a question that we're often asked, but all the behavioral disorders all have a common denominator, which is the reward pathway, which is dopamine-based, and it also involves your temporal lobe, which has memory, it involves your prefrontal cortex, which has cognition, and so, absolutely, and the behavioral disorders, you have to look at those from a neuropharmacologic standpoint also. And that's often a good way to enter into treatment.